With the European continent lying in ruins, emerging at the end of World War II were two powers with any power left. Superpowers. The United States and the Soviet Union. But the United States was much stronger. The Soviet Union had just lost 20 million people fighting in the war, and the US had nuclear bombs. Even though they had been allies in defeating Hitler, the distrust between the nations was deep, and the ideological differences were vast. The Soviet Union established a number of puppet communist states in Eastern Europe for the primary reason of providing a buffer between Germany and Russia to protect themselves from the possibility of a third German invasion in the 20th century. In the eyes of the US, the world, and particularly Europe, needed to have free market economies to provide for and buy our industrial goods, and thus was the start of roughly 45 years of Cold War tensions between the US and USSR. Throughout the decades in which the US and USSR were at odds, the relative heat levels between the conflicts were constantly fluctuating. The start of the Cold War was hardly cold by any standards. America used its military in the very real ways and in very real wars in both Korea and Vietnam, in an effort to stop the spread of communism in all parts of the world. But as time progressed, the cost of the war became a reality to those in America. America's young men were being drafted to fight in a war on the other side of the world on behalf of another nation in a brutal and losing battle, shown daily on the TVs at home. And so came the presidency of Richard Nixon, who promised that the United States will participate in the defense and development of allies and friends, but America cannot and will not conceive all the plans, design all the programs, execute all the decisions, and undertake all the defense of the free nations of the world. Nixon, along with his Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, attempted to cool off Cold War tensions with the policy of détente, in which large-scale military operations would end and friendly relations would be developed with the Soviet Union and Communist China. While Nixon did begin the process of withdrawing American soldiers from overseas, the reality of his new Cold War approach included just as much death and destruction, just in the form of intervention through secret intelligence and state-sponsored terrorism. And more than anywhere else in the world, Latin American countries felt the effects of these policies. The repeated sentiment by multiple Cold War presidents is that the US could not afford to have another Cuba. That is, having another country in America fall to Marxist ideology and form close bonds with the Soviet Union. The fear in these times was very real, particularly following the Cuban Missile Crisis, where the Soviet Union secretly positioned nuclear warheads in Cuba less than 100 miles from the coast of the US, which paralyzed the nation for 2 weeks and almost triggered the outbreak of nuclear war. In order to protect against threats of left-wing politics taking root in South American countries, the U.S. supported a covert operation in South America called Operation Condor, in which historically at odds countries in South America, all recently brought under the rule of right-wing military governments, formed a coalition in stamping out left-wing sympathizers and opponents to the military juntas and right-wing governments in South America. After the governments of what are referred to as the Southern Cone Nations, along with representatives from the U.S. State Department, met in Buenos Aires in 1976, the plan to stop insurgencies was solidified with the tightening of previously loose borders, the implication of a specialized communications system called Condortel, an encoded means of communication among Condor states similar to the Enigma machine used by the Nazis in World War II, and the training of South American intelligence, military, and police forces. At this point, independent U.S. allied South American dictatorships had been working with the United States Southern Command, Southcom, and the School of the Americas, a program which had trained soldiers from across the hemisphere in military tactics and counterinsurgency. Under Operation Condor, the proportion of trainees coming from Latin America skyrocketed. Trainees were educated on communist ideology, psychological warfare, guerrilla warfare, and fields that would help them nation build: agriculture, education, medicine, infrastructure. These highly educated operatives would comprise the secret police agents of each Condor participant nation, forming death squads, enabling each country to rout out expatriates from abroad and ensure they're unable to organize a global opposition, either by dragging them back to their home country or by ensuring they never return. And nowhere was this terror felt more deeply than in Argentina. By the 1970s, Argentina already had quite the history with a military role in politics. There had been at least one military coup in every decade between the 1930s and 1970s. During the 53 years since the first military coup in 1930 until the last dictatorship fell in 1983, the military ruled the country for 25 years, imposing 14 dictators under the title of president, one every 1.7 years on average. Throughout these decades of political turmoil, there was a period in which democratically elected President Juan Perón nearly served a full 2 terms throughout the 1940s and 50s. Perón was a populist candidate who, through robust welfare programs, held the support of Argentina's poor. The relative stability of the Peronist years had a lasting effect on Argentina, even far after he himself was replaced in a military coup and exiled to Spain in 1955. The new dictatorship in power imposed a ban on Perón's Justicialist party and began the persecution of its sympathizers, policies that would be maintained by successive governments over the following 18 years. It wasn't enough to squash the popular support of Perón, however, and in 1973 the military stepped down and elections were held in which Juan Perón was once again elected president after almost 20 years exiled in Spain. Perón was joined by his wife, Isabel Perón, as vice president, who unpopularly took power after her husband died less than a year after taking office, leaving her to deal with the political and economic instability facing the country. Those who had previously supported Perón in the 1973 elections had decisively split into left and right-wing factions. During the time of Isabel Perón's presidency, there were multiple left-wing guerrilla organizations, the two most significant being the Montoneros, composed of left-wing Peronists, and the ERP, or People's Revolutionary Army, who were communist revolutionaries backed by Cuba. In opposition to these groups was the state-funded terrorist organization, the Argentine Anti-Communist Alliance, or AAA, which was created by Isabel Perón's chief advisor and funded in part by American money. These guerrilla groups all employed their own tactics of warfare against one another and the Argentinian people, kidnapping, murdering, and torturing opposition. Along with the political instability and violence during the Perón years was a crippling economy with inflation rates at over 300% yearly in 1974. During Isabel Perón's presidency, the Argentine military, headed by General of the Army Jorge Videla, grew to dislike the paramilitary power of the AAA and saw opportunity to take power among the instability. Videla was a delegate for the Inter-American Defense Board, or IDB, and shared plans for a military takeover of the government to his Washington contacts. A since declassified CIA report identified Videla as the voice of patience, curbing his subordinates' enthusiasm who wanted a coup immediately. On the night of March 23, 1976, a military junta composed of the main branches of the armed forces instated themselves in a bloodless coup, overthrowing President Isabel Perón and establishing a bureaucratic authoritarian state headed by Videla. Many welcomed the new government as an antidote to the chaos of violent political factions and economic instability. As Operation Condor took off, however, with express aid from the United States and collaboration between South American dictatorships, stamping out the opposition became the top priority of the new government, waging a war on its own people. The military, now in charge of Argentina, with the support of the United States and allied Operation Condor participant nations, was fixated on squashing any opposition to their dictatorial rule. As part of their process of national reorganization, as it was referred to. Under the rule of General Videla, Congress was dissolved, democracy eradicated, civilian courts closed, political parties banned, media censored, and skies blackened with smoke from burning books, all in the interest of their ultra-nationalistic and conservative agenda. In the following years, anyone suspected of leftist or Peronist sympathies, as well as factory workers, trade unions, students, intellectuals, journalists, social workers, even members of the clergy, everybody could fall afoul to the country's new death squads. And this was the start of the Dirty War. While a war centered on your own people is certainly no good for popular support, what it is good for is ensuring an opposition party can never take roots, legitimize, or organize enough to hold your actions against you. Dissenters were abducted and imprisoned without trial, and incarcerated in one of the 520 detention and torture centers throughout Argentina. The majority of those who walked through those gates never returned. They simply disappeared. That's how Argentinians used to call them, los desaparecidos. The mothers of the disappeared began staging silent protests in the central Plaza de Mayo in Buenos Aires. They were the Madres de Plaza de Mayo, later to be joined by the abuelas or the grandmothers. The activism demanded answers from the government, mostly centered around the the truth surrounding the fate of their children. In most cases, it was a truth too ruthless to imagine. The suspected enemies of the state were subjected to atrocious tortures regardless of their age or gender. Journalist Jacobo Timmerman survived state-administered torture by electric shock. He later revealed how during his captivity, one of the torturers had clarified their ideology to him. Argentina has three main enemies. Karl Marx, because he tried to destroy the Christian concept of society. Sigmund Freud, because he tried to destroy the Christian concept of the family. And Albert Einstein, because he tried to destroy the Christian concept of time and space. Every brutal regime has its own methods of mass murder: gas, forced labor, firearms. In the case of the Argentine junta, it was death by gravity. Special cargo flights were loaded with hundreds of passengers. They had been stripped naked, bound, hooded, and sedated. The planes took off flying over the estuary of the River de la Plata, where the river meets the Atlantic Ocean. Then, the plane doors opened and the prisoners were dropped from a height of hundreds of feet. These were the vuelos de la muerte, the flights of death. Some of the victims may have died immediately. Others survived the initial impact with their bones shattered, only to be drowned immediately afterwards. Decades after, the regime admitted to killing between 7,000 and 9,000 dissidents, but the Madres and other humanitarian sources say the number is really between 12,000 and 30,000. And the Dirty War was responsible for another type of victim. Between 1976 and 1983, the Argentinian military kidnapped between 400 and 500 babies born in captivity to incarcerated dissidents. These babies were then given to couples with ties to the military as adopted children. Most of them grew up without knowing their real origins, who their parents were, and whether or not they were still alive. Decades later, only 109 of the children were able to trace their origins. In addition to fighting internal threats, real or imagined, Videla had to deal with a collapsing economy and rampant inflation. His government was ill-suited to economic matters, and they made things worse. Videla and his economic minister, José Martínez de la Hoz, favored foreign investment from private corporations while incentivizing foreign trade. As a result, industrial output and infrastructure greatly declined. At the same time, inflation skyrocketed, and so did foreign debt. In an attempt to rally the country with nationalism in the face of the terrors of the Dirty War and the collapse of the economy, Argentina hosted the World Cup. They also started a war with Britain, invading the Falkland Islands in the South Atlantic, a British dependent territory. In response, Britain sent a naval force to the region and made an amphibian assault on the islands. Conflict lasted 74 days and ended with an Argentine surrender after the deaths of 649 Argentine military personnel, 255 British military personnel, and 3 Falkland Islanders. The defeat ended U.S. support, bankrupted the government, and further soured public opinion of the dictatorship, prompting large protests against the ruling military government, hastening its downfall and the democratization of the country. The reign of the national reorganization process in Argentina extended only 1 year after the United States stopped directly supplying the regime. Operation Condor ended 6 years later. Today, it's estimated that upwards of 60,000 people around the world were murdered or disappeared, and 400,000 people were taken as political prisoners as a result of Operation Condor. While the blood of thousands is certainly to be blamed on the obfuscation of democracy in Argentina and other similar Latin American countries, it is also to be partially blamed on the obfuscation of democracy in our own country. Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, who held the position of Secretary of State for 4 years under Presidents Nixon and Ford, often celebrated for his diplomatic genius, said, "The issues of today are too important to be left to vote." He was a man who believed America has no friends or enemies, only interests, and had no issue breaking the law. This framework of foreign policy neither started nor ended with Kissinger and has been the cause of suffering around the world, from Japanese cities turned to ash, hundreds of thousands bombed in Cambodia, the torture of Latin American civilians, and governments toppled and propped up in the Middle East and all over the world. This is a force often wielded and exercised in backroom meetings or through overextensions of presidential power. That we, as a nation, have not declared war in over 80 years, yet have hardly had a moment we weren't fighting in one. Even those with the power to restrict the overreach of secret intelligence are kept in the dark, with evidence that the CIA intentionally obfuscated the extent of their knowledge of Operation Condor from the Carter administration. In just the last year, Drone strikes took lives in Afghanistan, and we continue to arm police in apartheid Israel. Our foreign intervention has propped up authoritarian governments and birthed terrorist groups, and it's something we've failed to learn from. Maybe one day it will come that human rights are not peripheral to the foreign policy of the United States, and in our pursuit of human rights, great power and tremendous influence serves the creation of a better world, a world in which human beings can live in peace, in freedom, and with their basic needs adequately met.